Everyone knows the word Chernobyl. It has become a symbol for disaster, for silence, for a world poisoned by its own technology. Some people know the word Fukushima, the wave, the meltdown, the panic. But before all of that, there was another. An event buried so deep in the shadows of history that even now, it sounds like a ghost story. It happened in a part of Russia that was never supposed to be on any map, in a place the world was not meant to see. There were no television cameras, no frantic evacuations shown to the world. There was only a single sound, a deep, muffled blast from underground. And after that, nothing but dust. That dust carried something invisible, something deadly, something that would follow the wind for hundreds of kilometers. It poisoned the ground, the water, the animals, and the people who had no warning. This was September 29th, 1957. The world would come to know it only by the nearest city on the map, Kyshtym. This story starts with the Cold War. After World War II ended, the Soviet Union rushed to build nuclear weapons. In 1945, Joseph Stalin ordered the creation of a secret industrial site to produce plutonium for the Soviet atomic bomb. They chose a remote stretch of land in the southern Ural Mountains, between the towns of Chelyabinsk and Kyshtym. Here they built the Mayak Production Association, also known as Combine 817. Mayak was never supposed to exist. It was a closed city, hidden from maps, called Chelyabinsk 40. Later, its postal name was Chelyabinsk 65. No civilians could enter. Guards patrolled the roads, barbed wire fenced off everything. Inside those fences, 6 nuclear reactors churned out plutonium, and chemical plants processed radioactive waste around the clock. From the very beginning, the plant had a major problem: where to put all the high-level liquid waste from reprocessing nuclear fuel. At first, they dumped it directly into the Techa River, contaminating villages downstream. When the illnesses and deaths became too obvious to ignore, they switched to storing the waste in dozens of large underground steel tanks, buried beneath earth and concrete near the reprocessing facility. Each tank was massive, made to hold cooling liquid waste that was so radioactive it boiled from its own heat. Pipes ran through the tanks, carrying water to cool them. But there was one unspoken rule: if the cooling ever stopped, the tank would turn into a bomb. By 1956, one tank deep in the Mayak complex, Tank 14, a massive underground steel cylinder, was slowly becoming a time bomb. This tank sat beneath 3 meters of earth and a concrete roof in a row of similar tanks, just a few hundred meters from the reprocessing plant. From the outside, it was invisible, just a patch of grass-covered ground within a barbed wire compound. Inside the tank was a mixture of high-level liquid waste from chemical reprocessing: nitric acid, uranium residues, fission products like cesium-137 and strontium-90. The liquid was supposed to stay cool. A series of water-filled pipes ran through the tank, designed to carry away the heat. But sometime in 1956, the cooling system for Tank 14 stopped working. Perhaps a blocked pipe, perhaps a failed valve. There are no records. There was no automatic alarm. There was no one assigned to manually check the temperatures. And so, no one noticed. Month after month, the liquid began to boil away. slowly leaving behind a thick crust of dried salts and nitrates. Every day the tank got a little bit hotter. It was a slow process, so slow that not a single person saw a warning sign. The silent buildup lasted almost an entire year. By September 1957, the liquid had turned into a semi-dry sludge, and the sludge was unstable. What no one realized was that the contents were now close to triggering a chemical runaway. All it would take was a little more heat. Under the quiet forests of the Urals, one tank was becoming a bomb. On September 29, 1957, at approximately 4:22 p.m. local time, workers at Mayak heard a sound they had never heard before. Some described it as a deep underground thunderclap. Others said it sounded like the earth itself splitting. Tank 14 had reached its breaking point. The mixture of nitrate salts and dried radioactive waste reacted violently. A massive chemical explosion ripped through the tank, equivalent to 70 to 100 tons of TNT. The force of the blast was so powerful that a 160-ton concrete roof was blown into the air and came crashing back down in pieces. The surrounding storage building was torn apart. Windows shattered across the complex. Workers hundreds of meters away felt the ground shake, but there was no flame, no fireball, and no mushroom cloud. Instead, there was something worse. The explosion blew a massive cloud of radioactive dust straight into the sky. In that single instant, 20 million curies of radiation escaped. 9/10 of that radioactive waste settled right there at the Mayak site, coating buildings and trees in invisible poison. The remaining 10%, 2 million curies, rose into the wind. The plume, a dirty, invisible banner, began to drift to the northeast. No one outside the fences heard the explosion, but the fallout was already on its way toward them. The cloud moved fast. Over the next few hours, it stretched into a trail almost 350 kilometers long. This invisible path, which scientists today call the East Ural radioactive trace, passed directly over dozens of villages, farms, and forests. Beneath it, 270,000 people lived normal lives. That night, the fallout began to settle. Fine, unseen dust-coated rooftops, fields, gardens, and rivers. It landed on the food people would eat the next day, on the wells they would drink from, and because it was invisible and silent, no one took shelter. In the days that followed, the first signs appeared. Children playing outside began to feel nauseous. Some vomited. Farmers noticed strange burns appearing on their skin, like sunburn, though the sky was cloudy. Horses collapsed in their pastures. Cows stopped eating, dogs howled, then lay down and died. A week later, trucks arrived in some of the closest villages. Soldiers wearing masks and heavy clothing shouted at families to pack and leave immediately. But they did not explain why. In total, around 10,000 people were evacuated from 23 villages within a month of the explosion, but hundreds of other villages were left behind. 250,000 people stayed in the contaminated zone for months, even years. By the next spring, bulldozers came. They demolished the abandoned villages. Entire communities were flattened and buried under the ground, erased from maps. Those who had lived there were never allowed to return. Inside the Soviet Union, the accident was referred to only as an incident. There was no public statement. Medical records from the contaminated zone were classified. Doctors were told to diagnose radiation burns as dermatitis. Workers at Mayak, who were contaminated in the cleanup, were ordered to stay silent. Most had no idea how dangerous their exposure really was. Internationally, the world heard nothing. There were no foreign journalists near Mayak. Only years later, Western intelligence agencies started noticing strange signs. Areas near the Ural Mountains that had been evacuated without explanation. Unusual radiation levels in soil samples collected thousands of kilometers away. Satellite photographs showing a blank, fenced-off city that did not appear on any maps. Rumors began to spread in the 1960s about a nuclear disaster at Kyshtym. But with no evidence, no one knew if it was real. It took until 1989, 32 years later, for Moscow to finally admit the truth. And even then, the details came out slowly, piece by piece. The path of the radioactive cloud left behind a scar, a 300-kilometer-long zone where contamination seeped into every corner of the land. It is now called the East Ural Radioactive Trace. In this zone, the soil holds strontium-90 and cesium-137 even today. The rivers are poisoned. Fish caught here are too contaminated to eat. What used to be a thriving stretch of farmland and villages is now a restricted area known as the East Ural Nature Reserve. On maps, it looks like wilderness, but it's a wilderness created by catastrophe. The forests are quiet. Too quiet. Geiger counters click constantly. For decades, scientists have studied the long-term effects on the people who lived in the trace. Higher cancer rates, birth defects, immune disorders. No one knows how many deaths this single explosion caused. Thousands, at least. Maybe tens of thousands over the decades. Kyshtym is ranked as the third worst nuclear disaster in human history. It was worse than 3 Mile Island, and yet, for most of the world, it is almost unknown. The reason is simple. It was buried in secrecy, erased from maps, kept in the shadows for over 3 decades. Unlike Chernobyl, there were no TV cameras, no footage, only a silent explosion in the woods, and a trail of invisible dust that poisoned the earth. This was not a reactor meltdown, not a nuclear bomb. It was a single tank. A tank full of waste that no one was watching. A tank that, when ignored long enough, became a silent weapon against its own people. No photographs, no warning. This disaster was buried in silence.